Welcome back. If you finished the previous video segment, you should have a pretty good understanding of how slavery victimized the slaves. I'm hopeful that you can understand by now that it was more than just a simple whipping or holding people captive, although that was an obvious victimization of slavery. But it ran much deeper than that. It was the stripping of humanity from the slave that Douglas was really talking about, and I think that that goes a long way. Now, one of the more radical aspects of Douglas's argument is that slave owners were also victims of the slave system. Let me point out what he's talking about here. If you open up the book, this book, to chapter 5, which in this book starts on page 61. If you're online, it starts on page 52. Toward the bottom of this paragraph, there's a sentence that starts out, "The slaveholder as well as the slave is the victim of the slave system." Find that sentence. "The slaveholder as well as the slave is the victim of the slave system." You can put me on pause if you need to. The slaveholder as well as the slave is the victim of the slave system. A man's character greatly takes its hue and shape from the form and color of things about him. Under the whole heavens, there is no relation more unfavorable to the development of honorable character than that sustained by the slaveholder to the slave. And what is he saying there? Well, I don't know about you, but I think what he's telling us is that slavery turns good people into bad people seemingly overnight. Because to be a slave owner, you have to engage in evil acts and evil deeds. So I guess if you wanted a sophisticated way to say this, it corrupted souls. It turned good people into bad people. Or as Frederick Douglass puts it, I believe the quote is on page 119 in this book, "Slavery can turn a saint into a sinner." I'm going to give you two examples of this process. The first example is going to come from Frederick Douglass's owner, Captain Anthony. So for this book, I want you to turn it to page 63. If you have the online text, it'll be on page 53. The paragraph that we're going to look at here starts out, "One of the first circumstances," again, if you've got this, page 63, if you're online, page 53, "One of the first circumstances that opened my eyes to the cruelty and wickedness of slavery and the heartlessness of my master was the refusal of the latter to interpose his authority to protect and shield a young woman who had been most cruelly abused and beaten by his overseer in Tuckahoe. This overseer, Mr. Plummer, was a man like most of his class, little better than a human brute, and in addition to his general pluricracy and repulsive coarseness, the creature was a miserable drunkard. He was probably employed by my old master less on account of the excellence of his services than for the cheap rate at which they could be obtained. He was not fit to have the management of a drove of mules. In a fit of drunken madness, he had committed the outrage which brought the young woman in question down to my old master's for protection. This young woman was the daughter of Millie, an aunt of mine. The poor girl, on arriving at the house, presented a pitiable appearance. She had left in haste and without preparation, and probably without the knowledge of Mr. Plummer. She had traveled 12 miles barefooted, bare-necked, and bareheaded. Her neck and shoulders were covered with scars, newly made, and not content with marring her neck and shoulders with the cowhide, the cowardly brute had dealt her a blow on the head with a hickory club, which cut a horrible gash and left her face literally covered with blood. In this condition, the poor young woman came down to implore protection at the hands of my old master. I expected to see him fill the air with curses upon the brutal Plummer, but I was disappointed. He sternly told her in an angry tone he believed she deserved every bit of it, and if she did not go home instantly, he would himself take the remaining skin from her neck and back. Thus was the poor girl compelled to return without redress, and perhaps to receive additional flogging for daring to appeal to old master, the overseer. Is Old Master a bad guy? Think about what Frederick Douglass has to say about his master. He says that he could be kind-hearted, almost fatherly as a figure. If you read down in the next paragraph, which would be on page 64, probably page 54 of the online text, Old Master seemed furious at the thought of being troubled by such complaints. I did not at the time understand the philosophy of his treatment of my cousin. It was stern, unnatural, violent. Had the man no bowels of compassion? Was he dead to all sense of humanity? No. I think I understand it now. This treatment is a part of the system rather than a part of the man. Think about that for a second. The treatment was a part of the system, not necessarily a part of the man. Go on. Were slaveholders to listen to the complaints of this sort of overseer, the luxury of owning large numbers of slaves would be impossible. It would do away with the office of overseer entirely, or in other words, it would convert the master himself into an overseer. It would occasion great loss of time and labor, leaving the overseer in fetters and without necessary power to secure obedience to his orders. In other words, in order to be a slave owner, you had to engage in evil acts like the one committed against this poor slave girl. All right, example number 2. If you've got this book, flip it to page 105, which is the beginning of chapter 10. If you've got the online text, this is going to begin on page 92. By the time that you get to this point in the reading, you'll understand that Frederick Douglass had been farmed out to Baltimore. He had been sent to work for one of the friends or relatives of his owner, a guy by the name of Master Hugh Auld, A-U-L-D, Auld. Anyway, Douglass describes his encounter with Mrs. Auld, Sophia Auld, who was the mistress, or the wife of Hugh. There's a sentence that starts out on page 105 of the book, 92 of the online text. She was, meaning Mrs. Auld, she was naturally of an excellent disposition, kind, gentle, and cheerful. Read that section. What you'll find is that naturally Mrs. Auld was a good, kind-hearted person. He's got nothing but good things to say about her. If you read on, he says, to this fact, the dear lady no doubt owed the excellent preservation of her natural goodness of heart, for slavery can change a saint into a sinner and an angel into a demon. Go on to page 107, or page 93, if you have the online text. At first, this might be page 94 in the online text. At first, Mrs. Auld evidently regarded me simply as a child. Find that section, page 94 online. At first, Mrs. Auld evidently regarded me simply as a child. Like any other child, she had not come to regard me as property. This latter thought was a thing of conventional growth. The first was a natural and spontaneous thought. In other words, when she first met him, her natural inclination was to greet him as a child. He was a human being. A noble nature like hers could not instantly be wholly perverted, and it took several years to change the natural sweetness of her temper into fretful bitterness. In other words, when he first met her, she was a nice person, and she had to learn to hate him, to view him as property, to view him as a slave. In other words, her soul, her values were corrupted by the system of slavery. How did this happen? Well, if you flip to the next page, 108 or 95 in the online text, it's her husband, Master Hugh. There's a paragraph that starts out, Master Hugh was amazed at the simplicity of his spouse. Find that paragraph. Master Hugh was amazed at the simplicity of his spouse, and probably for the first time he unfolded to her the true philosophy of slavery and all the peculiar rules necessary to be observed by masters and mistresses in the management of their human chattels. Mr. Auld promptly forbade the continuance of her instruction, she was teaching him how to read, telling her in the first place that the thing itself was unlawful, that it was also unsafe and could lead to mischief. To use his own words further, he said, if you give that N-word an inch, he will take an L. He should know nothing but the will of his master and to learn to obey it. Learning would spoil the best N-word in the world. It would forever unfit him for the duties of a slave. And as to himself, learning would do him a good deal, or no good, but probably a great deal of harm, making him disobedient and unhappy. If you learn him how to read now, he'll want to know how to write, and sooner or later he'll be running away with himself. Think about what happens to Mrs. Auld in the aftermath of this talking to given to her by her husband. She becomes an angry, bitter, nasty person, and it speaks volumes to what Douglas is talking about, in that slavery literally can turn a saint into a sinner. Her natural instinct was to be kind and nice to Frederick Douglass, but after she was taught how to be a slave owner, all of that went out the window. It all changed. Or in short, her values were corrupted. Her humanity was corrupted. So part of the way that Douglas believes that slave owners were victimized through the system of slavery was the corruption of their souls. It turned them into terrible, terrible people.